An unusual story happened in the castle on the Great Crumble Hill. A pretty girl, Amber, whose eyes reflected the pain of the decision she had made, stood in front of a broad-shouldered man. Jim was Amber's husband, and looked at her with hidden passion. Just as Jim was about to kiss Amber, she revealed her family's terrible secret. She wasn't her mother's biological daughter. Feeling guilty, the girl could not stay in Jim's arms and pulled away from him. But Jim wasn't particularly concerned about Amber's secret. He walked up to her again and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Amber was captivated by her husband and didn't realize how the next second he was kissing her passionately. Jim's passion overwhelmed him, shutting out all his emotions, and he pushed Amber onto the bed. She was overcome with horror when she saw his naked body, because she had never seen anything like it before. Jim continued to shower her body with kisses, despite her defensiveness. In desperation, Amber covered her face with her hand so that Jim would not see her tears. He had no time for her tears. He wanted to make her pay for the deception, but he was able to stop himself. The girl understood that if she didn't complete the divorce, she would fall in love again and everything would be over. Jim was the emperor's nephew and appointed commander-in-chief of his army. Amber was the daughter of a marquise and was distinguished by her extraordinary beauty. One day, she secretly entered a ball that her family was holding in their castle in honor of another holiday where she was forbidden to enter. Noticing her at the ball, her mother became very angry and poured out all her anger on her. As punishment, Amber's mother locked her in an empty and dirty closet. After sitting there for several hours and completely losing hope, she heard the click of the lock and he appeared in the doorway. Jim walked up to Amber and, without any words, gently took her hand and led her along. The couple went out onto the balcony, which overlooked a beautiful garden, but no one dared to break the silence. Jim looked at Amber and understood that she was still so young, just a child, but he had his own goal for getting to know her. Deep down, he felt awkward being around her and didn't know how to start a conversation. But suddenly, breaking the sound of silence, Amber asked what the name of her savior was. Unexpectedly for himself, Jim was captivated by her voice. He introduced himself and told a little about himself, but this was their last dialogue. Many years later, Jim became not only a war hero, but also received land in East Mason and a majestic castle. After receiving the title of Duke, Jim proposed to Amber, and they got married. Amber was happy that she was finally free from the shackles of her parents, and that her destiny was next to her. But everything was not so rosy. One morning, Amber came to wish her husband good morning, to which the Duke responded with some cruelty. Jim didn't understand why she came to him, what she wanted to achieve by doing this. Jim's harsh words hurt Amber's heart, and she could not answer him anymore. The Duke said she could do anything from renovating the castle to organizing receptions. However, he asks her not to disturb him with her presence any longer, and with these words, he left the hall. Amber was left alone with thoughts of why he married her if he was so indifferent to her. Jim was always busy with his own affairs, which is why Amber was always alone, even during mealtimes. She wondered what was going on with her husband, why he was so cold to her, whether she had done something wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted by a maid who entered the dining room and announced that Amber's father had come to see her. At that moment, she was happy, but not because her father had come, but because, at least for some time, she would not be alone. Marquis Morgan Eloi sat in the living room, looking terribly displeased, because only his daughter came out to greet him. Amber tried to justify Jim, saying that he had a lot of work to do at work, and that was why he was unable to greet the Marquise. Morgan was not satisfied with his daughter's answer, and he made a few more barbed remarks towards the Duke. After the Marquise had consoled his vanity, he handed his daughter a strange bottle, and he told her to slip it to the Duke to maintain his virility on his wedding night. Amber didn't understand why she needed this strange bottle with questionable contents. As if reading his daughter's thoughts, Morgan explained that it was time to tie him to herself so that he wouldn't wander around on the side. Still very young, Amber was in great shock at what her father was offering her. Morgan, however, did not relent and pushed the potion towards his daughter again, dropping the words that only a child would secure her position. The Marquis looked at his daughter haughtily and repeated his words, hinting that it was her duty. The girl sat stunned by her father's words, holding back tears. She still took the bottle and hid it in her box. All day, Amber thought about the strange conversation with her father. She did not understand how she could do what he asked. Every time she remembered how persistently her father had spoken about using the potion, she felt a flush of heat. There was no doubt on Morgan's face that this was exactly what his daughter had to do for her future. But this was not the future the young lady dreamed of. clutching the bottle to her chest. The conversation between father and daughter ended as strangely as it had begun, and Morgan, throwing words of contempt towards the Duke for his absence, left. Amber was left alone again and looked after her father, expecting him to say a kind word to her. The girl's expectations were not met. She once again realized how alone she was in this world. Returning from her memories, the girl nevertheless decided to ask the local doctor what kind of medicine her father had given her. An hour later, Duke Jim received a guest. This guest turned out to be Amber's father, Marquis Morgan Eloy, who was looking for Jim to deliver a letter from the Emperor. Handing the letter to the Duke, Morgan noted that the message was very important, and therefore the Emperor had ordered it to be delivered to him. Jim chuckled, saying that the old Marquis was very suitable for the role of the messenger who had crossed half the empire to deliver the letter. Morgan was furious at the impudent boy's words and struck back. The Marquis accused the Duke of disloyalty to the throne, and that Morgan was here to restore order. Hearing about the disloyalty to the throne, Jim broke into a sarcastic smile. Lost in thought, the Duke said that his marriage to the Marquis's daughter was already a sign of devotion, and that he did not understand what else the Emperor wanted. The old Marquis, with an air of importance, began to talk about how he and Amber needed to have a child, and then the Emperor would leave him alone. However, Jim was not so stupid and understood what Morgan was getting at. The birth of a child meant giving up the title. It was now that Jim realized what they wanted, an heir they could control. The Marquis tried to convince the Duke that this would not bode well, since the heir would be his own son, and the child would have his blood. After thinking for a while, the Duke replied that he could not object if that was what the Emperor wanted. But he also added that since the main thing for the Emperor is that the heir has his blood, it is not so important who his mother will be. Morgan screamed at the Duke's words. He could not accept such impudence. Jim immediately explained that he could not have children with the Marquis's daughter, because looking at her, he saw Morgan in her, who was unpleasant to him. Without waiting for an answer from the old man, the Duke stood up proudly and left. Morgan was so insolent that he couldn't even string a couple of words together. He had never met such an impudent person before. Jim and his servants had already left the room at that time, walking with his head held high, completely oblivious to the old man's incoherent cries. The Marquis, who remained in the room, was finally able to control himself and promised the Duke that he would still pay for his words. The next morning, sitting in the dining room at breakfast, Jim was reading a letter from the Emperor when Amber suddenly appeared at the door. She moved like a swan in the water, and if she weren't who she was, maybe something could have worked out for them. Sitting down at the table, Amber almost immediately felt sad, because her husband did not pay any attention to her, as always. Jim continued reading the letter, and only after some time said that he was going to go to the Emperor. Before Amber had time to think about being alone again, the Duke announced that she was coming too. Her joy knew no bounds. She would finally get out of the castle and have a good time. Amber spent a few moments lost in her thoughts, wondering how it would all go, what she should take with her, what she should wear, and how she should behave. But as soon as she turned her attention to Jim, all the joy disappeared, and he sat detached again. Jim, meanwhile, was remembering the past and thinking about what else the Emperor needed, why he still didn't trust the Duke, his nephew. After all, it was the Duke who, from the age of 17, devoted himself to the Empire. He fought for the Emperor's lands. Jim has thousands of deaths behind him, and he has walked through life all this time, stepping over mountains of bodies. He even agreed to marry the daughter of the old Marquis, the Emperor's servant, and even after this, they dared to accuse him of infidelity. After finishing breakfast, Jim decided to leave, telling Amber only that he would leave first. Amber, like a devoted wife, wished him an easy journey and continued eating. Despite her husband's coldness, she was glad that they had spent this morning together and that they had a trip together ahead of them. The imperial palace was so majestic and powerful that it was impossible to take your eyes off it. Jim arrived at the palace first, and as expected, bowed before the Emperor. Amber followed him into the palace. She felt awkward being in the Emperor's palace. Emperor Karl Vane and Empress Emily Vane were very welcoming and greeted the Duke and his wife. To maintain social conversation, and for the sake of decency, the Duke inquired about the Emperor's health. After briefly answering Jim's question, Karl turned to Amber, saying that he had not been able to see her since the wedding. Amber thanked the Emperor for everything he did for her well-being. Karl was incredibly happy with Amber's words, because he knew how difficult it was to be with and accept a nephew with his character. Jim felt uncomfortable listening to everything the Emperor said, but he could not say anything because he was his uncle. Amber liked Carl. He was more caring and polite to her than her husband. However, a shadow of doubt about his kindness still arose in her soul. On this note, the Emperor and Empress left the young couple, leaving them alone. In the evening, the palace looked even more majestic, but at the same time, it reflected a certain mystery. Jim and Amber walked into the dining room refreshed, and despite being married, there was a huge gap between them. Also sitting at the table were the Emperor's children, Jax and Alexandria. They were younger than Jim, but they behaved majestically. Jim was silent as always. He wanted this dinner to end as quickly as possible. Despite his nephew's behavior, the Emperor was in a good mood, and after drinking wine, he thanked them for their visit to the palace. Emily immediately responded to her husband's words, saying that it was all thanks to Amber, and Carl agreed, because he was so happy that his nephew had married the daughter of his devoted servant. The girl was flattered by the Emperor's words, but when Carl started talking about the child, Amber felt uneasy. The conversation about children did not go unnoticed by Jim either. He was perplexed as to why his uncle was so concerned about this matter, and began to conduct the dialogue in a raised voice. Jax and Alexandria had never heard Jim speak like that before, and were shocked by what was happening. The Duke's next words took everyone present by surprise. Jim proposed to dissolve his marriage with Amber, to hold back her tears and not show her emotions to those around her. Amber looked down and tightly clutched the hem of her dress in her fists. The Empress nevertheless noticed Amber's reaction and felt sorry for the poor girl. Emily immediately turned to Jim and asked him to stop this dialogue, because such jokes were crossing all boundaries of what was permissible. However, Carl stood up for his nephew, saying that most likely he had done nothing wrong. With undisguised sarcasm, Jim replied that, of course, he had been misunderstood, and that he simply wanted to show his loyalty to the Emperor. The uncle understood his nephew's actions, and both sat in great tension, barely containing their emotions. Seeing the flushed expression on the Emperor's face, the Duke was pleased with himself and made it clear that he understood what His Highness's actions were leading to. The atmosphere at the imperial table was tense to the limit, and only Amber was upset by everything that was happening. She already regretted that she had gone to the palace with the Duke. Then, unexpectedly for everyone, the legitimate heir, Jax, stood up from his seat with shouts and turned to his father. Everyone at the table turned their attention to Jax, and he, a little confused, began to talk about the upcoming day of the founding of the empire. The next day, there was a small reception in the palace garden, where high society gathered. When Amber appeared in the garden, all the ladies started complimenting her, clearly trying to become her friend. She felt awkward from so much attention, because she was always alone in the Duke's castle. One of the young ladies asked where Amber lived now, so that they could meet in the future, but she no longer listened to them. The girl was immersed in her thoughts about the past dinner with the Duke's relatives. She replayed Jim's words about ending the marriage in her head many times, and each time she convinced herself that he most likely didn't want this union. Completely lost in her thoughts, Amber suddenly heard a voice that sent a chill down her spine. It was her mother, Anna, a stately woman with bright red hair and an unpleasant smile. The woman acted like a caring mother, which made Amber very wary, because she knows what she really is. And while everyone admired this ostentatious relationship, Anna continued to ask her daughter about how she was doing in the Duke's palace. Amber was so confused by her mother's behavior in public that she didn't notice how everyone present stood and looked at them, as if expecting something. Without giving her daughter time to come to her senses, Anna continued babbling and suddenly started talking about how she and Jim should come visit them. But Amber didn't know how to persuade her husband to visit her home with her, because just recently he said that he didn't want to see her. She also remembered the conversation at the Emperor's table the previous evening about divorce. Looking away from her mother, she said awkwardly that she would try to persuade the Duke to find time among his affairs. In response to her words, Anna grabbed her daughter's hand tightly, as if hinting that she had no choice. And although the mother's grip was strong, outwardly she remained with the same good-natured appearance. Having freed herself from her mother, Amber said that she would come to her parents' house alone. The girl remembered the time when she had a younger brother. From that moment on, no one paid any attention to her. For her father and mother, she was a dirty spot in their family. Anna punished and mocked Amber in every possible way for any misdeed she thought she might have done. One day, she locked her in a dark room with one small window for talking to a girl from a poor family. That day, the mother showed her true face, which reflected all the hatred and anger. Instead of her name, Amber most often heard the nickname ungrateful brat, and even words of apology could not diminish the strength of the mother's disgust towards her daughter. From her memories, the girl remembered how Anna did not recognize her as her daughter from their first meeting, and if Amber had failures and defeats, her mother was only happy. The mother also did not neglect to limit her daughter's food intake if she committed any misdeed. Returning from her memories, Amber decided that even though she and the Duke already had a bad relationship, she would not quarrel with him because of her parents. Plucking up her courage and turning to her mother, she began to speak, but her mother interrupted her. Anna pretended to express her regret that the Duke would not be able to visit them. Ignoring her daughter's astonished expression, the mother continued to pour out words of understanding regarding Amber's husband's busy schedule. The girl still didn't know what to answer her mother, and she, taking advantage of the moment, asked her daughter to help her get the fan out of the carriage. Taking Amber by the arm, Anna almost forcibly pulled her along with her. And as was customary in society, when the ladies left, the ladies present began to discuss them. The carriage was parked right next to the road, so Amber and her mother had to walk a bit. Approaching the carriage, Anna asked the girl to help her get into it, and when Amber began to help, her mother seemed to accidentally kick her. She didn't expect such an act from her mother, and she screamed in pain and closed her eyes. The woman continued her bullying, saying that it would be a shame if a scar remained on the girl's beautiful face. But as soon as Anna saw the employees passing by, she turned into a caring mother again and asked Amber if she was hurt. When the girl tried to get up, her mother offered her her hand and told her to quickly take her hand. The daughter understood why her mother was pretending, because for everyone, she was the ideal wife of the Marquis and mother to the children. While Amber was thinking about her mother's behavior, the woman's face distorted with anger, and with no small amount of cruelty, she told her daughter to quickly take her hand. Anna stood over her daughter and looked at her with contempt. The girl had nowhere to go, and she took her mother by the hand. As soon as Amber found herself face to face with Anna, she threw in her face the phrase that she had no option but to bring Jim to their home. The mother reminded her daughter that she must perform convincingly in the role she was given. After all, it is thanks to this role that she is still alive. After reminding Amber once again of her duties, Anna left. That evening, while waiting for Jim in his living room, the girl recalled her meeting with her mother and did not understand what she should do. The silence was broken by a servant who, noticing the lady's upset state, brought her chamomile tea. Taking the tea and taking a sip, Amber asked him if he knew when the Duke would return. The servant couldn't answer exactly when Jim would return and left, and Amber began to wonder whether her husband would be angry that she had come to him. Lost in her thoughts, the girl again remembered her mother's words that she had no choice and that she and the Duke were obliged to come to her parents' house. Amber realized that she was very tired of this life, and she wanted freedom, so that no one would dictate the rules of life. Previously, it seemed to her that living in anticipation was already familiar to her, but today it became a burden. At this time, in the Crown Prince's office, Jim and Jax were talking. The topic of conversation was the upcoming day of the founding of the Empire. The Duke asked the prince why he should guard the capital this time, and not the Imperial Guard. Jax replied that he had entrusted the security to him because he trusted the Duke more than anyone, since he was also part of the Imperial family, and he was waiting for a positive answer. The Duke, in his usual manner, left without answering. Returning to his quarters, Jim passed by the servants and overheard them talking about his wife. The servant girl told the young man that the lady had been pale during the day, and she had sent her to bed, but she probably should have called a doctor. The young man added that he had brought Amber chamomile tea, and the servant girl had praised him for it. Continuing the conversation, they began to joke and perform their duties. But when they saw the Duke passing by, they began to greet him and bow. The Duke passed them in silence, and the servants continued their conversation. Jim entered his room and began to undress. When he heard someone snoring, he turned towards the sounds and saw Amber lying on the couch. The Duke was surprised to see her in his room, as she had never been there before, and this made him curious about what she was doing there. Amber was whispering something in her sleep, and all Jim could make out was the word "mama." He immediately remembered how the servants had talked about the lady's poor health and decided to attribute it all to the girl's condition. Despite the tense relationship between them, he did not wake her, but gently picked her up in his arms and carried her to the bed as if she were something intimate. With unusual tenderness for himself, the Duke laid Amber on the bed. The girl fell asleep so deeply after an emotional day that she didn't even wake up when Jim moved her from the sofa to the bed. For some reason, Jim couldn't leave right away. He stood by the bed for a while, watching his wife sleep. He himself did not leave the room, but stayed here in case Amber woke up and needed something. After some time, Jim heard a whisper. A girl was barely audible saying something. Looking at Amber, he noticed that she was still sleeping and thought that perhaps she was delirious due to feeling unwell. The girl suddenly woke up and sat up in bed, not fully understanding where she was. When she looked around, she saw Jim sitting in a chair and remembered that she had been waiting for him and had apparently fallen asleep. But the girl also remembered that she was sitting on the sofa and woke up already in bed. Could it really be that he carried her and put her to bed? As if reading her mind, the Duke said that a doctor had come and suggested that she had a cold. However, the girl did not feel any cold. Most likely, she had this condition due to the meeting with her mother. She continued to sit in Jim's bed and looked around. There was a cup of water and medicine on the table next to the bed, and it seemed that it was the Duke who called the doctor. Jim listened to her in silence, and Amber thanked him for his care and took the medicine. After this, the Duke asked his wife why she had come to his chambers. She didn't know where to start a conversation about her mother's request to come to their house. Jim began to be irritated by the girl's behavior, and he asked her to tell him the reason for her appearance in his room as soon as possible. As soon as she started speaking, she immediately stopped herself, mentioning that they were husband and wife. The Duke responded to this by saying that Amber need not worry or be afraid of him in this regard, but she still became confused and decided that it would be better to just leave now. However, when Amber decided to get up and leave, Jim came very close to her and leaned down, placing his hands along hers. Taking hold of the bow of her dress, he tugged it and said, "Why don't they spend time as husband and wife now?" Amber got scared and asked him to stop, but Jim didn't think of stopping. He continued to whisper to her about the rapprochement of their bodies, about how they would share this warmth between each other. Finding himself above Amber, the Duke looked at her slyly and asked if this was what she wanted. At that moment, the girl became scared. She didn't know what to do or how to stop Jim. She just asked him to stop. Seeing the girl's fear, the Duke stood up and moved away from her. Amber said she just came to talk and didn't want anything like that. After these words, Jim was a little disappointed, but continued to listen to the girl. Covering herself with her dress untied in front, Amber asked if he could visit her parents' house with her, as her mother had requested. However, afterward, she added that if he couldn't, it was okay, and headed for the door. Jim was surprised by such a request, but what struck him most was the girl's words that she was trying to protect him. As Amber approached the door, she began to lose consciousness, and the next moment, she did not understand how she found herself in the Duke's arms. He picked her up abruptly, but with great warmth, and carried her back to the bed. Having put the girl on the bed, Jim said that she should stay here, and he himself would go to another room. Amber did not understand where such concern came from on his part, and asked why he was doing this. But the Duke replied that she could think whatever she wanted, and left the room. There was a servant standing at the exit of the room, and Jim ordered her to call the doctor for his wife again in the morning. Amber lay there, and couldn't believe that all this was happening between them. He called a doctor, caught her when she almost fell, and although there was no love in his gaze at her, there was still something tender and tremulous in it. She didn't know what the Duke really felt, but she hoped that someday he would remember her as that little girl. Closing her eyes, Amber felt Jim's embrace again, which was indeed very warm and cozy. Meanwhile, the Duke went to take a bath and also thought about Amber. He recalled her words about protection and chuckled at how she was going to protect him if she herself was losing consciousness from feeling unwell. The next morning, they rode in a carriage to Amber's parents' house. Amber is still surprised that the Duke put his business aside and came with her. They sat opposite each other, but Jim did not want to look at her and preferred to turn away out the window. Amber remembered how a servant came to her in the morning and told her that the Duke had finished his business and was ready to go with her to her parents. While she was wondering why he had done this, Jim distracted her by asking how she was feeling. The girl was pleased with the Duke's attention and care, and she thanked him for it. It was very sunny outside, and Amber thought that perhaps it was because of the Duke's presence nearby that the weather was so clear. When they arrived at Amber's house, they were met by the Marquis. Morgan expressed his surprise that, despite the Duke's busy schedule, he found time to meet with them. But Jim was not so positive and curtly replied that the Marquis knew he was busy and had ordered him to come anyway. The old Marquis ignored the Duke's words and suggested drinking tea in the garden. While tea was being prepared, Amber took Jim around the castle and showed him the paintings that the Marquise treasured so much. The Duke, with all his grandeur, walked past the paintings and looked at them until they reached one painting. The portrait depicted little Amber, the same age when they met. The girl added that her mother did not like this canvas, as it was often hung for show. Jim looked at the canvas in silence and said nothing. While the Duke was examining the painting, Amber looked at him and decided to ask him a question. She didn't know where to start the conversation, but she really wanted to know why he did this. And when she had already begun to speak, they were interrupted by a servant who announced that the tea was ready. However, the Duke did not ignore her attempt to ask a question and asked again what she wanted to ask. But Amber had already changed her mind about asking the question and said that it didn't matter for now and she would ask another time. The girl hurried out of the picture room and urged Jim to follow her into the garden. For him, it remained a mystery what exactly she wanted to ask. They came out into a garden in which there were many statues and servants bustling about. The Marquis immediately appeared and began asking the Duke how he liked the castle, to which Jim replied that there were too many paintings there. Morgan began to admire his wife and how much she loved art. She especially holds in high esteem the painting depicting Amber, her beloved daughter. Hearing these words, the word lie escaped Amber's lips, but fortunately, no one heard her. As soon as the father noticed his daughter, he asked her to go away with him for a while, under the pretext that he had bought her a lot of jewelry and dresses. He left his courtiers with the Duke so that he would not get bored, and also suggested that he study the proposal for the city business. Morgan led his daughter down the alley into the depths of the garden and began asking how the Duke was doing and whether he was behaving too strangely. The father emphasized the phrase about strange behavior because he was worried that Jim had found someone on the side. Amber didn't know what to answer, because the Duke is always very busy, and all she knows is that he is always on duty. The father was not satisfied with his daughter's answer, and he began to press her, asking what she was doing in the mansion and whether she had given him the medicine he had brought her. The girl decided to pretend that she had completely forgotten about the medicine. The father was beside himself with anger at these words from his daughter. Without giving Amber a chance to say anything, her father threatened that if the marriage with the Duke broke down, she would no longer be his daughter, and that she must give birth to Jim's child if she does not want to be abandoned like her mother and rot alone. But what most affected the girl were the Marquis's words, that if she couldn't, she should use the potion and take it by force. Morgan didn't even listen to his daughter, but told her to obey him and do as he said. Amber could no longer listen to her father's punishment for seducing the Duke and using the potion. Having said everything he wanted, the Marquis let his daughter go so that Jim would not suspect anything. Amber ran as fast as she could from her crazy father, and there was only one thought in her head: to get rid of the potion as quickly as possible. The father called the courtier while watching his daughter leave. He ordered the servant to get the potion and give it to Amber, but without the Duke noticing. However, the Marquise did not notice how the Duke's advisor stood behind the bushes and heard everything. Soon Jim and Amber returned to their castle, and each went about his own business. The girl went straight to her chambers and began to look for the potion, but could not find it. She asked her servants if she had found the bottle, but the servants were only afraid that the lady's thing had disappeared, and that she might be blamed for it. She began to justify herself by saying that none of the maids would have dared to take anything from Amber's room. And then Jim appeared in the room, and with a strange grin asked if they had lost anything. The girl was very surprised by her husband's appearance, because he had not visited her before, and upon his arrival, he said that he had a lot of things to do. Amber began to stutter in surprise, and was unable to utter a word. But then the Duke took out that very bottle before her eyes. At that moment, the ground disappeared from under Amber's feet. She did not understand how the potion ended up in the Duke's hands. With the same grin, he asked if she wanted to tell him where and why she had the bottle of drugs and aphrodisiacs. The girl could not answer anything. She was frightened and confused, and the Duke continued to press. He accused her of pretending that behind her sweet face, there was actually a terrible and calculating essence. But the Duke felt something for her for the first time on the day he discovered her in his chambers. Then he watched her for a long time as she slept and muttered something in her sleep. Jim remembered how long she slept and did not wake up, moaning in her sleep, as if she was dreaming something terrible. And only after some time she woke up, and through the sleepy veil of her eyes, she called out to the Duke, that pure and innocent look still standing before his eyes. How she reminded him of the old Marquise, but at the same time she had many differences from him. The Duke remembered the moment when he decided to rudely find out the reason for her appearance, and how scared she was, and how her fragile body trembled. He even felt guilty for his actions at that moment, watching her try to recover from what happened. He also couldn't understand what she was trying to protect him from, and in general, how such a crystal girl could protect anyone. Despite the strained relationship between them, it was with her that Jim felt pity, guilt, and confusion all at once, and this worried him greatly. On the day they visited Amber's parents' house, the Duke met with his advisor, who overheard the conversation between his daughter and father. The advisor recorded part of their dialogue and gave the recordings to Jim. After reading the notes, Jim was very surprised at how calculating his wife turned out to be. The advisor also expressed his opinion that the Duchess was like a beautiful flower with thorns, and it was better not to trust her. Otherwise, one day she will point a blade in his direction. On that note, Jim left, and the advisor remained in Amber's parents' castle. Jim, as always, went first to his palace and found the very same bottle in Amber's room. Having shown it to a local doctor, he was amazed. It turned out to be an aphrodisiac. The doctor didn't stop there. A narcotic component was also found in the bottle, which makes this potion very dangerous. As the Duke was told, such vials are distributed among some aristocrats, and it is very difficult to obtain. Jim even laughed for a moment at his weakness in trying to trust this girl. He was distracted from his thoughts by Amber, who continued to explain something incoherently, but Jim no longer cared about her words. He tore off her mask, and he felt much better that the slightest feeling for her had disappeared. The girl couldn't let the Duke just leave. She ran after him, trying to stop him. Because of the tears that were flowing from her eyes, she stepped on the hem of her dress while running and almost fell. She begged Jim to believe that she had no intention of using the medicine, but rather that she was rushing into the room to throw it away. But the Duke cut her story short. He was no longer interested in her justification, and his slightest interest in her had disappeared. Moreover, from this moment on, he has no reason to respect her. Jim's last words took Amber by surprise, and she lost all hope of convincing him otherwise. Left alone again, she couldn't move. All she had the strength to do was stand, looking at the closed door and crying. Amber remembered the first time the Duke appeared in her life, and in him she saw hope for a better life. Whispering something unintelligible, the Duchess fainted next to the door behind which the Duke disappeared. A servant came running to her aid and tried to bring Amber back to her senses, but the girl didn't even move. She continued to whisper something, as if in a delirium. The Duke was already far from the door where he had left Amber, but he could still hear the servants shouting. The next day, the girl sat on the stairs and recalled the situation that had happened in the morning and the Duke's words. She looked at her hands, which still felt like Jim's hands were in them when she stopped him. The Duke did not want to see her, much less speak to her, after she had deceived him. But Amber still didn't calm down. She begged him to talk to her, because she wanted to tell him something important. For the last time, the Duke pulled his hand away and rudely said that he no longer intended to respect her, and that she should better stay in her bedroom. Amber was deeply hurt by the Duke's words, and she was unable to move from the spot, with treacherous tears streaming down her cheeks. But she still tried to calm herself down and convince herself that tears would not help in this situation. And the girl decided that it would be better for her to do something useful rather than cry. In this way, she hoped that the Duke would appreciate her actions and allow them to talk. Amber believed that Jim had a kind heart, which is why he worried about her and took care of her when she was sick. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the words of one of the maids standing nearby, that perhaps he had a mistress somewhere. Another maid continued the conversation by saying that he couldn't stand Mistress Amber, and that was why he didn't want to go home. The maids continued to gossip about the Duke and his wife, completely oblivious to her passing by them. Amber was stunned by the fact that everyone in the palace considered her to be some kind of evil. She couldn't stand it any longer and ran as fast as she could to her room, barely holding back her tears. As she ran, the cruel words of the maids sounded in her head, saying that it would have been better if she had never been in the Duke's life. The next morning, Amber sat in front of the mirror while her personal maid braided her hair. The girl decided to ask Lindsay if she knew when Jim would return, and if he would return at all. Lindsay wanted to somehow calm the hostess down and said that the Duke had been late like this before, or had arrived very late. And in order to somehow distract Amber from sad thoughts, she asked about the girl's plans for the day. Amber said she was going to read at the library, but Lindsay suggested they stroll through the market and buy something instead. After thinking for a bit, the girl finally agreed to go for a walk and take her mind off the current situation. At the same time, Jim and his assistant Luke were talking about the smuggling investigation. Luke reported on the developments in the case and who they suspected. Jim was concerned about both the transactions themselves and the participants, so he demanded that his assistant speed up the process. It was also known that there was a large organization that traded in the red light district. Amber's father, Marquis Morgan Elois, was also involved in this, and the Duke wanted to catch him and punish him. Luke understood his Duke's intentions, but warned that the smugglers were well hidden. But he would try his best. Jim was ready to put all his efforts into catching Morgan Elois and those behind him red-handed. The assistant silently accepted all the Duke's instructions and bowed as a sign of respect. However, he still expressed his bewilderment that the Marquis would be a real fool if he gave himself away by taking such risks. After all, he must understand that if you play the role of a pawn, sooner or later you will be sacrificed. Jim gave Luke a couple more instructions and let him go. But the assistant was in no hurry to leave. The Duke looked at him questioningly, expecting a question. Luke hesitated a little, and then asked if the Duke would like to assign security to his wife, so that Amber would not harm the Duke, since she had been raised by the Marquis for many years. Luke's words angered Jim, and he ordered him to get away. The assistant was taken aback by the Duke's tone and asked him again, but he did it in vain, because Jim became even more furious than he had been before. Luke didn't say anything else, just bowed and began to leave the office. Already at the door, he remembered that he had not reported to the Duke about the unrest on his land. Jim didn't answer, but just looked at his assistant with a puzzled expression. Amber and Lindsay were walking through the local market when a strange man accidentally bumped into them. The next moment, Amber sees another man grab her maid from behind and cover her mouth. The Duchess was about to scream and call for help, but the man who had crashed into them told her to be quiet and go with him if he did not want her maids to get hurt. But Amber screamed for them to let go of Lindsay, and then the man covered her mouth with his hand. He ordered her to remain silent in a harsher tone if she did not want to get hurt. Amber tried to calm down and remembered her childhood and a bouquet of lilies of the valley. Her birth mother promised to make her a bouquet of lilies of the valley when she got married. That's why they ended up in this part of the market where they sell those very lilies of the valley. The maid, noticing this, asked her if she liked the flowers and if she wanted to buy them. Without thinking twice, Amber bought a bouquet of lilies of the valley and began to feel much better. After shopping, Lindsay suggested that the Duchess choose a place to have a bite to eat. As they walked through the market rows, the maid expressed the idea that they should have taken a porter, as they had bought a lot of things. It was at this moment that those same unknown men appeared on their path. One of them seemed to accidentally push Lindsay in the shoulder, causing her to drop her bag of stationery and fall to her knees. Amber immediately leaned over to her to see if they were okay. Lindsay was so worried about the dropped groceries that Amber had to calm her down. And then she heard the man's mocking tone. The man came close to them and looked down on them like a hawk on its prey. At this time, Jim and Luke were passing by the market, and the Duke noticed something amiss out of the corner of his eye, and no longer really listened to his assistant, who was telling him about the atmosphere in the domain, as well as about the monsters on the border. Luke, noticing that Jim wasn't listening to him, looked in the same direction and asked what was going on there. Jim noticed stationery from the bag scattered on the ground, which was very strange. But, having put these thoughts aside, he returned to Luke, and they continued on their way, talking. At the same time, Amber and Lindsay were being held captive by hooligans in the alley of the market. Amber tried to break free, but she couldn't. The man had grabbed her too tightly. The next minute, she felt someone pushing her captor in the back, and he fell, causing her to fall too. The blow sends the man flying to the ground and hitting his head, and the Duchess hears the sound of a sword. The man became angry at the blow, and uttering a curse, began to turn around to see his offender. Amber also raised her head and was unexpectedly surprised when she saw her husband standing in front of her. Jim looked at her with both sadness and anger and asked what she was doing there. After all, he had already warned her once to stay in her room and not leave the palace. Amber tried to explain herself to the Duke, but she didn't know where to start. She seemed so frightened that she forgot all the words. She suddenly realized that her leg had twisted badly when she fell to the ground. Before she could think, Jim was at her side and picked her up, leaving her even more speechless. After some time, the Duke's assistant Luke appeared, and Jim ordered him to organize a carriage. Having carried Amber to the carriage, he put her inside and, uncharacteristically, asked if everything was okay with her. Having received a positive answer from the girl, he turned to the maid and ordered her to return immediately to the palace. Amber understood that if not now, then it was unknown when she would have the opportunity to talk to the Duke. While Jim was giving instructions to the maid, the girl was thinking about how to start the conversation so that he wouldn't push her away again. And finally, she asked him if it was because of her that he had not returned to the palace for a long time. After all, she feels guilty about that story with the aphrodisiac, although she didn't want to use it on the Duke. However, Jim did not believe her this time either, and once again said that he was not mistaken about her and did not trust her words. Amber looked at him with such clear eyes, in which one could read a complete lack of understanding of the situation. This look irritated Jim very much, and he revealed the secret that from the very beginning, he did not want to take her as a wife. These words hurt Amber very much. She sat in the carriage and did not understand why he did this, but she was still able to tell him that she liked him and had liked him from the very beginning. She remembered again their first meeting, how he took her from the dark room, and how they sat on the balcony. However, the Duke's words that she was mistaken brought her back to reality, and Jim walked away, also saying that her feelings were absolutely useless to him. Amber was left alone again, hurt by her husband's words. A few days later, Amber went to the Emperor's palace for the founding celebration. In the hall, she was met by the Empress and her daughter, who seemed very happy to see her. But they immediately took the Duchess by surprise with questions about the Duke. After getting ready, she said that he was very busy, so she arrived early alone. She also shared with them that since their last visit to them, he had not appeared in the palace, which surprised the Empress and her daughter. However, almost immediately, she tried to justify him, saying that it was all because of the monster's unrest on the border. The Empress was very kind to Amber and immediately supported her, saying that it would be good for her to spend time in female company. Alexandria also treated her warmly and offered her some tea. During tea, Amber showed attention to the Emperor's daughter and inquired about her health, as she had not been feeling well in the morning. Alexandria assured the girl that everything was fine with her now, but she couldn't say the same about Amber. These words made the Duchess embarrassed. She did not know what to answer, but luckily for her, the Empress entered the room. Emily invited them to join the evening mass if they didn't mind. As she left, she added that there would be priests there who would pray for expectant mothers, and looked meaningfully at Amber. Entering the temple, the Duchess saw a priest standing with a cup in his hands and delivering a speech that made her feel warm inside. Amber stood in line to see the priest, but still didn't know if she was doing the right thing. But when the priest looked at her, she seemed to sense something and no longer doubted the correctness of her decision. The Duchess approached him and knelt down, at which moment the priest dipped his hand into a vat of holy water. Touching her head with his hand, he spoke and blessed her. Amber was still kneeling and praying when a tear ran down her cheek. Seeing this, the priest decided to ask the girl why she was crying. She looked at him with her eyes, but she couldn't say a word, because she didn't know how to explain what was happening between her and the Duke. When the priest saw Amber's face from under the veil, he recognized her and asked in return if she recognized him. But he was unfamiliar to her, because she had never seen him before. Having blessed the Duchess, the priest let her go and began talking with the other girls. As she left, Amber turned back to the priest once more, hoping to remember him. The Foundation Day celebration arrived, and the first to greet them was the Emperor's son, Jax. He, of course, made a sarcastic joke about the Duke's absence from the parade, and thought that he would not show up for the celebration either. But the Duke refuted his words. Jim said with forced friendliness that he couldn't miss the holiday. Just at that moment, drinks were brought to them, and the Duke, in order to relax a little, took a glass of wine. After taking a small sip, he added with a grin that he could not miss such a significant holiday for him. Ignoring the Duke's sarcasm, Jax announced that there would be a dance soon and invited his sister to dance. Alexandria happily agreed, because she loved dancing. Jax took his sister by the hand and led her to the center of the huge hall. Amber was inspired by her brother and sister's dancing and wanted to dance too. She decided to call the Duke, but he was talking engrossedly to someone and did not hear her. She tried to call him again, but realized it was useless. Amber felt lonely again. She stood and simply looked at the dancing couples, who were complete opposites to her. The Duke retired from the ball to the balcony to be alone, because he was very tired of the company of people. But he was alone for only a short time. Amber appeared from behind the door. She brought him tea, which would help him warm up and remove the remaining effects of alcohol. Jim didn't even turn to her, once again showing his attitude. Amber carried the cup of tea carefully so as not to spill it. When she approached him and placed the cup in front of the Duke, she said that he did not have to drink it if he did not want to. Jim was most annoyed by such care from Amber. He did not want to accept any signs of attention from her. The Duchess felt all the anger and hatred from him, and lowering her head, shivered, either from feelings or from the cold. This childish and naive look of the girl angered Jim even more, but he also saw the pain in her eyes that he caused. However, he didn't want to believe her. She had already deceived him once, looking at him in the same way with her pure gaze. Then he asked her about their marriage. Did she really think that this marriage would last forever? Amber was scared by this question. She was really afraid of losing the Duke. But Jim didn't ask this question without a reason. He hoped that this way she would understand everything and would no longer bother him with her presence. The girl had nothing to say to her husband. She realized that nothing could improve the relationship between them. Having apologized, Amber bowed and decided to leave. As she was leaving, she paused and told Jim that she would not bother him anymore. Closing the door behind her, she left him alone with his thoughts. When Amber left, the Duke could not understand why her words affected him so much, and why he could not stop thinking about her, because he did not like her. After standing for a while, he decided to leave, but heard someone's footsteps. A red-haired girl came out from around the corner, saying that she had unwittingly overheard their conversation. The Duke did not like the fact that someone was witnessing their dialogue, and asked the stranger who she was. The girl introduced herself as Missy, the daughter of Duke Ephron. Without giving the Duke a chance to respond, she continued and said that she could see how Jim hated his wife. The Duke wanted to push her away, but Missy was persistent and immediately asked if he wanted to form an alliance with her family. Meanwhile, Amber walked down the corridor, wondering what she should do now. She was so immersed in her thoughts that she didn't notice how she tripped and twisted her ankle. She stopped and lifted the hem of her dress to examine the full tragedy of the incident. As she was examining her leg, she suddenly heard footsteps from behind, and she thought it was the Duke. Seeing the priest in front of her, Amber was surprised. Despite the Duke's silence, Missy continued to persistently ask if he wanted to become related to her house. At some point, she realized that he didn't remember her, and she was disappointed, because in childhood they had discussed their possible engagement. Jim was shocked by such impudence, and sarcastically asked how often the girl had been dropped as a child that she would ask such questions of a strange man. The Duke's words seemed offensive to Missy, and she began to speak again, but the Duke had already passed her by. Without saying anything, Jim decided to leave, leaving the stranger alone. He returned to the dance hall in search of Amber. Looking for her with his eyes, he could not find her and began to get angry. Her image, voice, hair popped into my head. He heard her solicitously offer him a cup of tea. Having come to his senses, he drove thoughts of her away from himself, beginning to think that he was going crazy because of this girl. At this time, Amber was still in the corridor with the priest. He noticed that her ankle was injured and offered to help. Before Amber could say anything, the priest began to lean towards her leg to get a better look. Taking the girl's leg, he began to whisper something, after which he said that he was quite good at healing with the help of holy power. After some more conjuring, he released Amber's leg and stood up. The Duchess carefully lowered her leg and began to lean on it, and to her surprise, there was no longer any pain. The priest, saying he was glad to help, said goodbye to Amber and began to leave when she decided to ask if they had seen each other before. The girl's question pleased him, as if he had been waiting for it. The Duchess did not understand what the priest was happy about, and then the priest revealed the secret that he saw her when she was still a baby, and that is why she does not remember him. The girl was surprised why he still remembered her. The priest also said that when he saw her, he was 15 years old, and now he looks so young because he uses holy power. Everything the priest said shocked Amber. She couldn't believe he was now 37 years old. While she was amazed at his appearance, he stood and looked at her, as if waiting for the main question. And at that moment, it dawned on her that if he had seen her as a baby, then he knew her real mother. But the priest did not give her the opportunity to ask, since it was time for him to go, as if he did not want to be seen there. Not receiving an answer to her question, Amber again fell silent and became lost in her thoughts. Seeing this, the priest lingered and encouraged her, saying that she was very important to him and that they would meet again soon. These words seemed to give the girl wings, and all the sadness she carried with her seemed to be blown away by the wind of change. Soon the priest left, leaving her in this state. After some time, Amber's father sent her another letter, which she did not open, because she thought that there would again be instructions about the child and the seduction of the Duke. She was herself again, in her loneliness, and she did not understand how her father could demand such a thing from her. Sitting on the windowsill, she thought that if she became pregnant, Jim would be happy about the child. However, what kind of child can we talk about if he doesn't even visit her and constantly, as now, goes away somewhere? Amber was about to order her father's letters to be burned, but she remembered that her maid, Lindsay, was on leave today. Realizing that she had no one to talk to, she decided to go to her favorite place, the library. Walking along the corridor from the bedroom to the library, she met servants along the way who bowed to her. But when she had already passed them, she heard them discussing the incident with the bottle from her father. She was very angry at her father, because of him she again felt like a nobody. But Amber pulled herself together and decided that she wouldn't take all this to heart, but would distract herself by reading her favorite books. The library was her favorite place. Here she could be herself and not feel so lonely. After finishing reading and closing the book, she realized that she was starting to feel cold. Hugging herself, she headed towards the library exit. Amber tugged at the door handle, but it was locked, even though she hadn't closed it. The girl remembered that when she was coming here, there were maids in the corridor, but they couldn't lock her in. She started knocking and calling for someone to help, but there was silence in response. At that moment, when Amber desperately tried to call for help, no one heard her. The corridor behind the door to the library was empty. The Duchess pressed herself against the door to hear at least something behind the door, but she heard nothing, absolutely nothing. She continued to knock on the door with all the strength she had left, but the cold was taking its toll. With each movement, she had less and less strength left, and she could no longer move. Leaning her back against the door, she couldn't understand why she was locked here. The maids she saw on her way here often talked about her and the Duke, and did not understand why he kept her here. Did everyone in this house really treat her with contempt and hatred? However, Amber remembered the Duke and thought that he would definitely notice her disappearance. If, of course, he returned home. After that, everything was like a fog. She didn't understand whether it was a dream or reality, but Jim really found her. Amber seemed to have fallen into a dream, and at one moment, she seemed to be walking arm in arm with the Duke. But the next moment, she was alone again in the cold room. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the voice of Jim and another man, but she didn't quite understand what they were saying. Amber closed her eyes in frustration, deciding that this was just another dream. The Duke approached her when she opened her eyes and asked her with concern how she was feeling. Amber was surprised that Jim was next to her. He told her that he found her in the library, and he also found out with Lindsay's help that the other maids had locked her in on purpose. The Duke moved his chair closer to Amber's bed and asked what she would like to do with those who had offended her. He was ready to do anything to punish them for hurting Amber, but she didn't want to punish them in any way. She was too tired. Jim was puzzled as to why she had decided to leave things as they were, when she had been deliberately locked in the library where she could freeze to death. To this, the Duchess merely replied that he had achieved what he had always desired. The Duke did not understand the girl's words and asked her again what she meant. Amber pulled herself together with the last of her strength and told him that this was exactly what he had always wanted, for her to disappear and no longer interfere with his life. And he should be grateful to these maids for their actions. Jim ignored the girl's words and told her to eat and take her medicine. As he handed her a bowl of soup, their hands lightly touched each other. This touch gave the Duke a slight warmth, although he himself still did not understand why this was happening next to her. Amber broke the silence with a question about their marriage and the Duke's behavior. She didn't understand why he was acting like that. Jim listened to her silently and made sure she finished her soup and took the necessary medications. The girl really wanted to get answers to the questions that constantly tormented her, so she stopped eating and looked at Jim. The Duke rose from his chair and told her that he was still thinking about ending the marriage and that her feelings meant nothing to him either. However, there is something that haunts him, namely the feeling of weakness when he is around her. Leaving the medicine and a plate with the remains of the soup on the nightstand, he waited for Amber to fall asleep. The girl fell asleep very quickly, either from fatigue or from the soup and medication. Before leaving, Jim looked at the sleeping Amber again, and after making sure that she had fallen asleep, he left the room. As he left the girl's room, he called his assistant, who was nearby. Jim ordered him to gather all the maids who had locked Amber in, take them to the basement and punish them, and then send them out. Luke accepted all the instructions, bowed, and went to look for the maids. Jim was furious at the maids' actions and was serious about punishing them. As he walked away from Amber's room down the long corridor, he continued to hurl curses at the culprits. After a couple of days, Amber felt much better and went down to the dining room for breakfast. The Duke was already there and, as always, was sitting with papers, not distracted by what was happening around him. As Amber walked down to the dining room, she noticed the new maids who were treating her with great respect. They bowed to her, greeted her, and did not whisper behind her back at all. According to her maid Lindsay, by order of the Duke, all those maids were punished and expelled from the palace. However, the Duke's behavior did not change at all. As before, he did not notice her. Amber wasn't happy that he punished them anyway, even though she asked him not to. She blamed herself for reminding him of herself again and causing him so much trouble. After waiting a little, the Duchess decided to ask Jim how he was feeling. He looked up at her questioningly, to which she replied that he looked exhausted. The Duke, as always, remained silent and continued studying the papers. Even sitting at the same table, they were too far apart, and Amber could feel it. She began to eat her breakfast, pretending that Jim's silence did not bother her. The Duke carefully studied the documents that his assistant had brought him in the morning. At this moment, he was again distracted by the Duchess, addressing him in her guilty voice, which irritated him. Jim looked at her with his tired eyes, expecting another annoying dialogue. Gathering all her courage, Amber asked him when he was going to divorce her. This question left him in a state of shock, which is why he sarcastically asked her if she wanted to return to her father as soon as possible. Amber was confused by the Duke's attacks and tried to somehow justify herself. However, the Duke had no intention of trusting her, and so he hinted once again that there was no trust in her and never would be. The Duchess already knew Jim's feelings towards her, but his words still hurt her deeply. He saw before him his father's daughter, the same vile traitor. Jim reminded her how she wanted to seduce him with the potion, and nothing would change his attitude towards her. The Duke did everything to make her understand that she had nothing to hope for, and to stop making any attempts. Realizing she was about to burst into tears, Amber looked down and, with words of apology, left the dining room. Jim was glad that he was finally alone and could do his own thing. Having called the maid to come with her, Amber almost flew out of the dining room. But something made the Duke look after the girl and feel a pang of sadness. The next day was very sunny and somehow especially magical. Amber was in her room, waiting for the maid to get ready. When Lindsay appeared, the Duchess noticed a bouquet of flowers in her hands. Lindsay brought a new bouquet to replace the old and wilted lilies of the valley. She put them in a vase and showed them to Amber, who sat very sad and did not react at all to the bouquet of flowers. When the maid asked where to put the vase, the girl pointed to the table with little interest. Lindsay tried her best to distract her mistress from her sad thoughts and suggested taking a walk in the garden. Amber didn't even have the desire to move, but she still agreed to go out into the garden. The maid continued to talk about everything to distract Amber, but she was in her own thoughts. Through her thoughts, the Duchess heard Lindsay suggest that she take her mind off everything that was happening by gardening. But Amber only replied that the butler could handle it, and she herself was not sure that she would stay here until spring. Suddenly, the maids came out from around the corner, and as soon as they saw the Duchess, they immediately began to bow. They didn't raise their heads until Amber passed by, and this made her very sad. She didn't want them to be afraid of her. As they passed the maids, Lindsay told her that they were the ones who were close to the ones who locked her in the library. Amber just sighed heavily and moved on. Her maid called her, but the girl decided to ignore her and went on alone. Amber didn't want to do or feel anything anymore. She understood that there was no place for her in this house. At this time, an unfamiliar man was approaching the palace, who was clearly in a great hurry. The stranger turned out to be a priest who was at the founding celebration. He approached the palace very quickly, as if he wanted to meet someone as quickly as possible, but also to avoid being noticed. Amber was already in her room. The maid was tidying her hair. A servant entered the room and announced that the Duchess had a guest. She was surprised and could not imagine who it could be, but deep down she hoped that it was not her father. As she walked into the living room, she wondered who it was and was pleasantly surprised. Before her stood the priest she had met at the founding festival. He came to her because he was very worried about her and also wanted to talk. He also reported that Lady Alexandria was worried about her. Amber was pleased to hear this, because she had completely forgotten what it was like to have someone worry about you. After talking a little more about the Emperor's family, the priest noticed sadness in Amber's eyes. To understand the reason, he asked her if he could greet the Duke. But the girl, as if following a template, answered that he was not in the palace. He was busy with his own affairs, as always. The priest remained silent, but seemed to understand everything. The Duchess, like a true hostess, invited them to sit down and drink some tea. As they sat down on the sofas, Amber expressed gratitude that the priest had come to see her. In response, she received mutual feelings, as well as a question about what made her so sad. According to the priest, her sadness made him feel uneasy. Amber was surprised. No one had ever spoken to her so tenderly and sensitively, much less worried about her. To reassure the girl, the priest said that she looked very much like her real mother, and that he was there when Amber was born. He extended his hand to her and offered to take it. Amber cautiously extended her hand to the priest, and when their hands connected, something magical happened. Light poured from their hands, filling the entire living room and only getting brighter. At that moment, Amber's soul and heart felt warmer and calmer than ever before. The priest smiled warmly and reminded her that he could heal with power. He also told her that she was the very person he first saved. And then God rewarded him with divine power. Her mother called him to the birth, and the first blessing in his life was that the baby would be the happiest of all in the world. Amber let go of the priest's hand, and he asked her if she was happy now. She pressed her hand to herself and simply looked at the priest. The girl did not know what to answer him. The priest noticed this and said that it was his fault if she was unhappy. The next moment, he started to take something out of his pocket, saying that he had wanted to give it to her for a very long time. The box contained a pendant that contained his power. He called Amber special to him and wanted her to have the pendant. The priest placed the pendant in her hand, and she immediately felt the warmth emanating from the pendant. Amber was in a state of surprise. For the first time, someone had entrusted her with such a valuable thing. The priest said that he wanted her to be calm and joyful, and the pendant would help her with this. The Duchess hugged the pendant to herself, thanked the priest, and truly felt warmth and peace in her soul. The priest wanted to say something else, but before he could, the Duke entered the living room. Jim was surprised to see a priest in his palace, especially with Amber. When the Duke came closer to them, the priest introduced himself to him. His name was Thomas. However, despite Thomas's goodwill, Jim remained cold and immediately asked why he was there. The priest, with all his kindness, replied that he had been sent by Crown Princess Alexandria, who was concerned about Amber's condition and asked him to visit her. The Duke did not appreciate such care from Alexandria. Anyone's care was generally alien to him. Amber tried to act confident and not show her emotions. Afterwards, she offered to take Thomas to a room after dinner, where he could rest. From that day on, the priest stayed in the palace for some time and blessed each room. Amber was grateful for his presence. However short, he made her feel better. It was getting colder every day, and Lindsay suggested calling a tailor to take her measurements and make her some warm clothes. The maid noticed that the Duchess began to feel and look much better. Amber noticed the butler nearby, and there was someone else next to him. When they reached them, the other man had already left, and the butler looked a little confused. He said that a letter had arrived from Marquis Eloy. Amber's face immediately darkened. She understood what kind of letter it was, with more instructions from her father. She extended her hand to the butler and asked for a letter so that she could write an answer immediately. But the butler said that the letter was addressed to the Duke. This came as a bit of a surprise to Amber. Her father was up to something again, and she needed to find out what exactly. She again persistently extended her hand towards the letter and said that she would give it to the Duke herself. The butler was a little confused, and Amber, to be more convincing, pretended to be the real hostess and asked for the letter in a demanding tone. The butler had no choice but to give her the letter. When she took the letter from him, she asked if he knew where the Duke was now. When the butler said that Jim had his own country house, she was surprised, because Amber knew nothing about it. Having called a carriage, she went to the Duke's country house. On the way, she thought a lot about what the Duke really felt, and what he really wanted from her, why he hid so much from her. While Amber was driving to the country house, Jim was talking with Duke Ephron and his daughter Missy. Duke Ephron offered the Duke a divorce from Amber and convinced him that marriage with his daughter would be beneficial for himself. Jim listened attentively and did not interrupt, thinking about what this Ephron really wanted from him. Amber had already arrived at the country house and was confidently heading towards the entrance. As she walked along the path, she thought that this was probably the place where the Duke carried out his state affairs. Approaching the door, a certain woman with bright red hair came out to meet the girl. They almost collided at the door, and both began to apologize to each other, not yet knowing who each of them was. Amber felt uneasy around the stranger and wanted to find the Duke as soon as possible. But the girl was in no hurry to let her into the house and asked if Amber was the Duke's wife. The Duchess, with the same awkwardness, replied that she was indeed the Duke's wife and began to wonder whether she had seen this person before. The girl introduced herself as Missy, the daughter of Duke Ephron, and also, with some impudence, asked Amber what she was doing there. She was shocked by her impudence to speak to the Duchess like that. Gathering all her inner strength, Amber said that this was the house of His Majesty the Grand Duke, and demanded to know what she was doing there. Not wanting to give up her position, Missy replied with the same arrogance that they had come to see the Duke and discuss a few issues. Also, the daughter of Duke Ephron did not intend to let Amber into the house, explaining that the Duke was currently busy with an important conversation with her father. Continuing to mock, Missy added that she knew Jim was thinking about breaking up his marriage with the Grand Duchess. Amber was speechless from such attacks from a girl she didn't know at all, but she had no intention of stopping there and advised the Duchess to prepare for a divorce and perhaps even find someone to replace the Duke. Missy walked up close to the Duchess and looked into her eyes with victorious authority. After looking at Amber for a couple of seconds, the girl decided to leave and confidently began to move away from the house. The Duchess began to remember the maid's words about the Duke possibly having a mistress. Could this girl really be his lover? The thought scared her, and she grabbed the pendant. After an unpleasant conversation, Amber decided not to look for Jim and to return to the palace. At that moment, the conversation between Duke Ephron and Jim ended, and they went their separate ways. The Duke's assistant, Luke, immediately headed to his office, and as he passed by Ephron, he heard him swearing at Jim. Luke noted that Duke Ephron clearly did not like the dialogue with His Highness, and he remembered the words thrown in Jim's direction, just in case. When he entered the office, he immediately asked why the Duke had rejected Ephron's offer. Jim sat there deep in thought and did not immediately answer him. An hour earlier, Duke Ephron and his daughter Missy came to see him. They asked for a meeting supposedly on a very important matter. The proposal was to dissolve the current marriage and marry his daughter. In this way, Jim will get his benefit and finally get rid of the imperial shackles. Ephron tried to convince the Duke that the emperor was not acting in his interests, since he had spent his entire youth fighting for the empire. He also forced him to marry the daughter of a marquis who was loyal to him against his will. And now the Duke has the opportunity to dissolve this marriage, because isn't that what he wanted? Jim listened to everything, but with his usual grin, he asked Ephron why he assumed he wanted to end the marriage. Ephron did not immediately understand the Duke's intonation, and therefore hinted to him that they were alone here, and there was no need to pretend. He also added that his daughter had recently heard that you wanted to end your marriage with the current Duchess. This conversation was beginning to irritate Jim, and he expressed his dissatisfaction with Missy, comparing her to a mouse that climbs everywhere. Missy wasn't entirely happy with the comparison, but Ephron didn't pay it any mind. He was ready to indulge the Duke in everything for the sake of marriage with his daughter. Ephron mentioned once again that the possibility of marriage with his daughter would be a good chance to get rid of the emperor's shackles. Jim did not want to respond to Duke Ephron's persuasions, but he did not relent and suggested that they convict the Duchess of a crime and find some compromising materials. Jim was starting to get tired of Ephron's words and was starting to get angry. The Duke continued to praise his family, comparing it to the family of the Marquis. Jim couldn't stand it, and calling the conversation tiresome, concluded that Ephron was simply trying to foist his daughter on him. He didn't understand how his current marriage was different from what was being offered to him. Ephron tried to dissuade the Duke, but he had little success. Jim thought back to Amber and their recent conversation over breakfast, when she asked when he was going to divorce her. She was so innocent and sad at that moment, but at the same time, uniting with the house of Ephron was not a bad idea, but the Duke still did not want it. And so Jim voiced his decision. He was not going to divorce Amber. And so he asked Ephron and his daughter not to bother him with such trifles anymore. Jim confirmed Luke's words that he turned down Ephron's offer. Luke didn't understand why the Duke did this, because it was a good opportunity to annoy the Marquis. But Jim didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't need it. The assistant clearly didn't understand what was happening to his master and decided to ask a couple of questions. He reminded the Duke that Amber was the daughter of a vile Marquis, and that the Duke himself had recently wanted to dissolve this marriage. Jim didn't answer him. He just silently wrote something down in his papers. Luke watched the Duke closely, waiting for an answer. But Jim wasn't going to answer. He just said that it was late and time to go back. Luke had no choice but to follow his master. The Duke himself didn't understand what was happening to him. Lately, he had been thinking about Amber very often. Even now, walking down the corridor, he remembered her image, her hair, her trembling lips, her eyes full of pain. He kept having flashbacks to the times they were together, or when he saved her. And every time, an incomprehensible confusion and a strange tremor arose in the Duke's heart. That is why he decided not to dissolve this marriage for now, but to sort out the feelings that had arisen. Amber walked down the hallway, remembering Missy and her words about the Duke. The girl's words stuck in the Duchess's head, and she repeated them over and over again. At such moments, when her soul is heavy, Amber automatically grabs the pendant and she feels better. A little later, the Duke walked confidently along the palace corridor. The servants, seeing their master, immediately began to bow, and the butler announced that dinner was ready. But the Duke did not pay attention to them. He was going to Amber's room. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and in them was someone she didn't expect to see. Amber sat on the bed and couldn't believe her eyes at what she saw. She looked in surprise at the man who suddenly came to her. This man turned out to be a duke. He walked up to Amber and asked what she was doing. The girl replied that she was just sitting and waiting for him to give him something. She handed him the letter, the one from her father. Jim was surprised by the letter, but when he noticed the Marquis's seal, he decided that there was no point in opening it. He took the letter from Amber and thought for a moment. After a minute of silence, he asked her if she had had dinner, to which the girl replied no. Then Jim invited her to come downstairs with him and have dinner. The Duchess was surprised by her husband's behavior, because for the first time in their life together, he invited her to dinner. Jim waited silently while she prepared for dinner. On the way to the dining room, Amber wondered what had happened to him that he had changed so much. She was sure that he wanted a divorce, and Missy's words confirmed this, but she did not understand what was happening now. Jim walked majestically ahead, and Amber, lost in her sad thoughts, followed quietly behind him. Much time passed since that evening, but the Duke's strange behavior still did not end. Amber was in the greenhouse, talking to the butler. They were discussing what to order for the winter, when suddenly the door opened. Amber turned around at the familiar voice. Jim was standing in the doorway. It turned out he was looking for her, and was surprised that she decided to decorate the greenhouse. The butler stood nearby, holding in his hands a list of what needed to be ordered. Having noticed the list, the Duke asked the butler for it and began to familiarize himself with it. Amber included her favorite lilies of the valley to leave her mark on the place. However, when Jim saw lilies of the valley on the list, he suggested that she plant other flowers as well. The Duchess's heart melted at the Duke's wish, and she decided to enjoy the last moments spent with him. The Duke looked at Amber carefully, but said nothing. She looked at him in response, enchanted, and dreamed of seeing the lilies of the valley in full bloom. When the Duke began to leave, he ordered the butler to place vases of lilies of the valley throughout the palace. Amber was lost in her thoughts. She thought about how she felt better, and how everything in the castle began to seem different. She remembered life in the capital, and that there was no such winter there. It was warm there. She really liked winter, and that there was so much snow here. Jim was surprised that the girl was talking a lot today. According to the girl, it was all because of the snowy weather. It lifted her spirits. However, it surprised the Duke that frozen water had such an effect on Amber. But no words could spoil her mood. She continued to look lovingly at the falling snow. Here the Duke turned to her, looked at her thoughtfully, and began a conversation. But then he was interrupted by Luke's cry, who was approaching them. The assistant was in a hurry to report urgent news to his master. The news was that monsters had reappeared on the borders, and the soldiers needed the Duke's help. Jim was a little sad that he would have to leave the palace now. Amber had no choice but to watch the Duke leave and wonder what he wanted to talk about. She understood that the relationship between them had changed slightly, but she didn't know why this had happened. Suddenly, the Duke slowed down a little, turned around, and told her to dress warmer while she was walking without him. These words warmed her heart, but the Duke then added that if she got cold, she would get sick again and cause him additional trouble. But there was still some care and warmth in his gaze. Amber thought he would say something else, but he said nothing else. And after that, he and his assistant left, and Amber watched them go and was already beginning to miss the Duke. 2 days had passed since the Duke's departure. There was no news, and the girl was worried about her husband. Amber was in the living room drinking tea when her maid, Lindsay, came in. Lindsay reported that the Duchess had a guest, and it turned out to be her father. She didn't expect to see him, and she felt inside that something unpleasant would happen. The girl went to her father as quickly as possible because she knew how much he didn't like to wait. When she entered the office where her father was waiting for her, he was standing with his back to the door. Amber asked her father, with a guilty feeling, what had made him come so unexpectedly. But the father, without answering, turned sharply and hit the girl on the cheek. This blow came as a surprise to Amber, because she didn't even understand what she had done to deserve it. When she fell, her father stood over her with haughty severity, his face twisted in anger, and he asked her what she was doing there and why she hadn't gotten pregnant yet. The Marquis shouted at the girl for not answering his letters, and how dare she ignore them. He didn't let her say a word, and she couldn't answer anything while her father hung over her. Then the butler entered the office, hearing the noise, and asked if everything was all right. Father changed immediately as soon as he realized that his behavior could be seen by strangers. The Marquis, with a kind face, informed the butler that his daughter had fallen. Apparently, she was still weak. He extended his hand to help her stand up. When he picked up his daughter, he pulled her close and said that she was too thin, and therefore it was not surprising that the Duke was cheating on her, and so that the butler wouldn't suspect anything. He asked with paternal concern if she was eating well. However, the butler was very much preventing him from talking to Amber the way he wanted, and asked him to make tea to warm up his daughter. The butler went off to prepare tea, and the Marquis continued to hold his daughter tightly by the shoulders. As soon as they were alone, he began to treat her rudely again, and dragged her to the sofa. He jerked her onto the sofa so hard that she hit her hand on the back. He began to scold her for her insubordination and accused her of allowing the Duke to meet with another family. Amber could no longer hold back her tears, and so that her father would not see her pain, she lowered her head. He shouted that the Duke had met with them to break off his marriage with her. The girl replied that she knew about their meeting, which angered her father even more, and he grabbed her by the chest. The father continued to hurl insults at his daughter and hit her in the face again. Amber fell back onto the sofa, and her father reminded her that if the Duke abandoned her, she would no longer be his daughter. But she didn't care. She just replied that he could do whatever he wanted, which made the Marquis's face turn purple. The girl just wanted him to finally go away and leave her alone. The Marquis hit himself on the forehead, saying that she just needed to listen to him and then everything would be fine. And once again, he told her that she needed to get pregnant by the Duke in order to save the marriage. However, Amber responded to this by saying that she was not going to have a child against her will, and the Duke's. The fact that his daughter contradicted him made him very angry, and he hit her in the face again. Amber's face already had deep and painful abrasions. The Marquis finally realized what he had done, and understood what it would lead to if the Duke saw her in this state. After all, he remains a man, and she can easily seduce him. And her father didn't care how she did it, herself, or with the help of an aphrodisiac. Amber was so filled with sadness that she didn't have the strength to answer her father. She only thought that it was a real shame to have the same blood as this man. When the father left, the maid came into the office and was truly horrified when she saw Amber's face. Lindsay had always been very kind to the Duchess, and that was what made the girl most uncomfortable, seeing her like that. The maid immediately ran up to her and began to examine the abrasions left by her father. In complete horror, she began to wail that something cold needed to be applied quickly. To somehow come to her senses, Amber took out of the chest of drawers the pendant that the priest had given her. When she took it in her hands, she remembered the priest's question about whether she was happy now. She felt very sad, and a small tear ran down her cheek, which she could not hold back. Clutching the pendant to her chest, she wondered if she had ever been happy. And the answer came to her as to what she needed to do to finally become happy. A little later, the Duke walked quickly along the path to the palace. He was busy restoring order on the borders, and it took him a few more days than he had expected. On the way to the palace, he saw Amber, dressed only in a dress and a scarf draped over her shoulder. When he saw her, he thought how wayward this girl was. She would get sick again, and he would have to deal with her. The Duke called out to his wife, and she turned towards his voice. At first, he wanted to ask her why she came out undressed, but when he saw the bandage on her face, he immediately tensed up. He came closer and touched the place of the abrasions with his hand, asking how she could have gotten hurt. Amber didn't want him to touch her and removed the Duke's hand. He didn't understand why she did this and wanted to ask a question, but the girl interrupted him. Amber started talking about divorce. She asked him when he planned to do it, because this was the surest way to end his father's abuse. Jim was surprised that she brought up the subject again. The next thing she said was a request to end the marriage right then and there. Amber's words struck the Duke like a bolt from the blue. At that moment, Amber remembered her life, how she lived with her father, stepmother, and brother. She always wanted to be loved, to be noticed, but no one in the house cared about her. And one day, he, the prince, entered her life, took her with him, and gave her hope for a better life. They soon got married and lived happily ever after. But unfortunately, it was just a fairy tale. In life, everything was different. no love from my husband, and no care from my parents. For several days, while the Duke was absent, she hatched a plan for further action. Amber realized that the longer she was around him, the stronger her feelings for him became. And to stop this torment, they had to dissolve the marriage. However, the Duke responded to the girl's wish that the final word would be his. Jim also added that in this situation, she has no choice. Amber, barely holding back her tears, answered him that it didn't matter when it happened, if he would do it anyway. But the Duke only wrapped her in his coat. Seeing the Duchess's sad face, he asked what prompted her to make such decisions. Amber, without thinking twice, said that she had always been in his way, and that he had said many times that he didn't want to see her. But the Duke no longer listened to her, but removed the plaster from her cheek to see the wound. The girl felt pain from this, and she covered the wound with her hand. The Duke became very angry and began to demand that she confess who did it. But Amber didn't want to talk, to which Jim replied that he would figure everything out himself, but using his own method. He was very angry, but he couldn't understand why exactly, whether it was because she didn't trust him or because she was wounded. The girl caught up with the Duke and asked him not to torture or interrogate the servants, because they knew nothing. She gently took his hand to make him stop. Jim looked at her questioningly, and Amber asked what he would do if he found out the truth. And with sadness in her voice, she added that he didn't care about her wounds. Jim didn't know how to answer her, but he only said that her wounds worried him. This surprised the girl, because previously he didn't care about her condition. Jim could no longer look at such a sad and at the same time innocent girl. He left without saying anything. Amber had no choice but to follow him. Later, in her room, the girl tidied herself up, and Lindsay helped her cover up the abrasions. She recalled the conversation with Jim in his office a little earlier. Amber asked him again why he didn't give her a divorce, if that's what he wanted. But she still didn't receive an answer. Lindsay and the Duchess walked down the corridor and discussed preparations for the priest's visit. Amber also took with her the pendant that Thomas had once given her. She goes to him to help her sort out this difficult situation, hoping that his strength will help her find peace. On the way to the carriage, they were met by 2 soldiers from the Duke. They informed her that by order of the Duke, they were to guard her and would accordingly go with her. Amber was surprised by this action from Jim. The soldiers replied that they would protect her from anyone who tried to harm her. The Duke watched the carriage move away from the window of his office, ensuring that the soldiers followed it. Jim finally questioned the servants, and they admitted that the Duchess had only one guest that day. This guest was the Marquis, Amber's father, and the Duke could not understand why the father hit his beloved daughter. When he thought about the Marquis, he really wanted to hit him, so much so that his fists clenched. While he was thinking about this whole situation, Luke entered the office. The assistant brought information to the Duke on a question that had long tormented Jim. Luke discovered that Amber was not her mother's biological daughter and placed a document from the doctor on the table as proof of this. Jim read the document and realized that the girl was illegitimate, which is critical for an aristocratic society. The Marquis took a great risk by marrying his daughter to the Duke and hiding the truth from the Emperor and the Duke. Jim remembered that sad, pained look again. The Duke's assistant declared that this was a fraud in the marriage deal and that those responsible must be punished. The Duke remained silent and thought about the current situation and what to do. Luke continued to press him, saying that Amber should also be punished for lying, but Jim had already made up his mind. Without saying anything, the Duke simply burned the doctor's report. He also forbade the assistant to share the information they had learned. Burning the last piece of paper, he ordered him to destroy everything that was on this case. Luke was simply horrified. He did not understand why the Duke did this. But Jim didn't pay attention to his assistant's exclamations. He had already made his decision. Amber had already arrived at the temple to see Thomas. She walked up the steps, and soldiers followed her, guarding her. The girl almost stood up and said that she would go on by herself, without security. But the soldiers replied that it was the Duke's order. But Amber insisted that it was safe here, and they were not needed. There was nothing to do, and the soldiers remained outside the temple. Just before the door, the Duchess heard them saying that they needed to post a guard at the doors of the temple. As she opened the door, she thought that being under guard was very tiring. As soon as she crossed the threshold of the temple, an unfamiliar boy ran up to her and said hello. He was a boy of about 10 years old, and, in all likelihood, he also served in the temple. He pulled her by the hand and said that they were already waiting for her. But Amber hadn't warned anyone about her arrival, and was already starting to get a little worried. She asked who was waiting for her, and the boy replied that Thomas was waiting for her. When they entered the hall, a priest was already waiting for them. The boy reported that he had brought the long-awaited guest. Amber asked Thomas how he knew she was coming, to which he replied that he knew thanks to the pendant. After these words, the girl mechanically touched the pendant, which gave off warmth. The priest explained that his power, contained in the pendant, helps him sense her presence from afar. He also said that he guessed why she was here. She needed help. The girl looked at Thomas with her sad eyes and felt some relief that at least someone understood her. To continue the conversation, he invited her to sit down and have some tea. The boy who met her said goodbye to her and wished her good luck. He was beaming with happiness that he had managed to meet the important guest. Amber was fascinated by the boy and wished him luck in return. While they were saying goodbye, Thomas was already pouring tea for himself and the Duchess. When she sat down on the sofa, the priest asked her what was troubling the girl that she had come so far to see him. Throughout, Amber told him about her situation with the Duke, and he listened to her attentively. She admitted that she wanted to stop loving Jim and get rid of the shackles. But lately, he hasn't given her a chance to do this, constantly being around and showing strange attention. After finishing the story, Thomas replied that he could hardly comprehend the sadness that Amber had experienced. However, this did not frighten her. She felt better just because she had spoken out. Thomas said that he couldn't completely relieve her from pain, but he could still help her with some things with his power. But the priest's expression told her that she would have to pay for her help. Despite this, she agreed to this. She was ready to do anything to get rid of these shackles, and Thomas agreed to help her as much as he could. When Amber returned to the palace and entered the room, she found Jim there. His appearance surprised her, and she asked him what he was doing there. Jim had his back to the door and turned sharply when she asked the question. With his affected grin, he walked up to her and looked at her meaningfully. After a few seconds of silence, his expression changed, and he asked her if it was true that she was the illegitimate daughter of the Marquise. This question made Amber drop the box with the pendant. The box hit the floor with a loud bang, but did not open, which the girl was glad about. She did not want to explain to the Duke what kind of pendant it was. She answered Jim's question in the affirmative, which made the Duke even more surprised. He felt strange when he learned the truth about her. The girl was, after all, an illegitimate daughter, and she hid this secret, since it would have reduced her value for marriage. Amber thought this was a good moment, and thought about divorce again, because the revelation of such a secret is a good reason for divorce. The Duke listened to her silently, but said nothing. She stood in front of him and continued talking on this topic, and he continued to listen silently. When she finished speaking, he asked her where she would go if they divorced. He touched her cheek and said that returning to his family was not the best solution. Coming even closer and looking into her eyes, he voiced the long-standing decision that there would be no divorce, and she would pay for her deception. Turning away from him, Amber asked why he was doing this, why he wasn't letting her go, and the Duke reminded her that despite his attitude towards her, she liked him. Without giving her a chance to answer, he kissed her passionately on the lips, which she didn't expect. This kiss was very hot and at the same time gentle. He grabbed her by the back and hugged her even tighter. Despite the fact that the girl asked to stop, the Duke, without paying attention, pushed her onto the bed. Amber didn't understand what was happening, why Jim was acting like this, and why he was now pressing her tightly to the bed. The Duke was overcome by a passion that arose for the girl whom he had recently hated. He kissed her neck, tenderly and passionately, while simultaneously exposing her breasts from her dress. Pulling her dress down to her waist, he literally dug into her body, pressing his chest against hers. Amber lay on the bed, naked, feeling sick about what was happening, and through her tears, she begged him to stop. Jim broke off the kissing, noticing the tears on her face, and brushed one of them away with his hand. Confusion overcame him, and he pulled away from the girl and walked away. Amber was overcome with horror at what was happening and was unable to move for a moment. When the Duke left, she sat for a long time without moving and thought about why all this had happened. After what happened, Jim did not come to her room for several days. Lindsay brought her food to her room because she didn't want to go downstairs. However, Amber refused to eat. She had no appetite at all. The Duke strengthened his wife's security even more than before, apparently expecting her to escape. She didn't touch food all day. Amber thought for a long time about the Duke's words and thought that maybe staying in the palace was the best idea. However, she knows that Jim hates her. But then why does he act this way and not let her leave? He didn't care about her feelings, but there was no point in being offended, and this depressed her even more. Almost at night, she decided to leave the castle and see if the soldiers would stop her. She had already tried to go out the other day, and no one had stopped her or asked her any questions. But now, as soon as she left the room, one of the soldiers turned to her and asked where she was going. Amber said that she woke up early and wanted to go for a walk, to which the soldier replied that he would accompany her. However, the girl said that she wanted to go alone, and surprisingly, the soldier did not object. This came as a surprise to the Duchess, as she had expected the Duke to control her every move. She walked out into the garden and stopped. Thinking that soldiers often patrolled here, she instinctively touched the pendant and remembered Thomas's words that this pendant would bring her peace. But at their last meeting, he said that circumstances had changed, and he must use the power contained in the pendant to help her. When the priest took the pendant in his hands, light and incredible warmth began to emanate from it. Thomas also said that she was saved by this very power at birth, and therefore part of this power is contained in her heart. And to manifest these powers, she only needs to present the pendant to her chest. However, Amber's body was not yet ready to use this power, and it should only be used as a last resort. It was now that the girl thought that this was the very case, and she wanted to use force to hide her presence. While she was thinking, someone suddenly touched her shoulder and scared her greatly. She thought they were soldiers, but it turned out to be the Duke. Jim asked her what she was doing there at such an hour and where she was going. He held her tightly by the waist with one hand and by the wrist with the other, as if he was afraid that she would run away. Amber did not like this attitude and asked to be let go, to which the Duke, of course, did not respond. Ignoring the girl's indignation, Jim picked her up in his arms. He carried her back to the palace, still saying nothing. When they entered the palace, there were servants standing at the door, to whom he also paid no attention. He carefully carried her in his arms. Amber tried to free herself from the Duke's embrace and asked him to let her go, but he continued to carry her somewhere. They passed by the servants, who saw it all, but simply bowed silently, without saying a word. To Amber's surprise, Jim carried her into his room, and only there did he lower her onto the floor. In a commanding tone, he told her to stay in his room and not come out. She didn't understand his tone and actions. Jim left her in the room and decided to go to the office to calm his ardor. Amber asked him why he was doing this to her. However, he did not answer, but only continued to leave the room. As he walked down the corridor, he tried not to show his emotions so that the servants would not start gossiping behind his back. Amber sat on his bed for a while, not knowing what to do next. From that day on, she was locked in his chambers and could not go anywhere. He always appeared on the threshold. Once again, this made the girl very angry, and she asked him how much longer he was going to keep her there. Jim replied that if she tried to escape frequently, he would keep her here until she calmed down. This really irritated Amber, so she had to squeeze the hem of her dress to avoid being rude. The Duke, ignoring her behavior, concluded that she should say that she was staying with him and not start this conversation about divorce anymore. The Duchess only grinned in response, understanding what he wanted. Amber realized that he wanted her to continue living with him and remain a fake Duchess. However, even if she is not loved here, it is safest to stay with him. Without reaching an agreement, he left her in his chambers again. Amber had been refusing food for several days, and the Duke came to her to convince her that refusing food was a bad idea. He threatened to force her to take food, but she didn't care. The Duke tried in every way to persuade her to eat, but she responded to all his threats and persuasions with silence. Only after some time did she answer that she could manage without his care. He sighed, clearly tired of the girl's behavior. But after a while, Amber finally sat down at the table to eat soup. After eating a couple of spoonfuls, she demonstratively pushed her plate away and said that she was finished with lunch. Jim realized that she was doing it on purpose and asked her to stop being stubborn. He reminded her once again that all she had to do was say that she would stay with him and all this torture would end. But Amber didn't answer. She refused to acknowledge anything or understand his behavior. Getting up from the table, she headed towards the bed. The Duke watched her every move, and the girl's behavior was quite annoying to him. After a couple of days of such a hunger strike, Amber's condition worsened, and it was necessary to call a doctor. She slept almost all the time, and the doctor insisted that she be forced to go outside and breathe fresh air, and also that her food portions be increased. After a moment of silence, he added that for a quick recovery, she needed to be relieved of any psychological pressure from others. All the time while she was sleeping, he was next to her, putting aside all his affairs. Once again, her sleep was accompanied by delirium. The girl's condition greatly puzzled the Duke. While she was sleeping, he started talking to her and asked her not to leave him. He took her hand and wished that she would share her pain with him and look at him again as before. Amber began to come to her senses through her sleep. Sitting up abruptly in bed, she felt a headache, and everything went dark before her eyes. Looking around the room, she noticed that Jim was sitting and sleeping on the sofa. Amber wasn't sure if he was really asleep. Coming closer to him, she touched his head, but he did not react in any way. The girl thought that this was her chance to escape while he wasn't looking. Barefoot, she tried to walk very quietly so that the floorboards would not creak. But after taking a couple of steps, she felt his hands, and he easily picked her up in his arms. Sitting down on the sofa with her, he called her too stubborn. Then he asked her where she was going to go this time. And without giving her a chance to answer, he offered to leave with him tomorrow, which greatly surprised Amber. Suddenly, the girl felt a surge of warmth and the beating of her heart in response to the Duke's touch. At that moment, she realized that she couldn't leave him. Jim didn't want to let her go, and they sat hugging each other for a while. The next day, the entire palace was filled with lilies of the valley. Seeing this, Amber was so delighted and at the same time surprised that he did this for her. Then he appeared and confirmed that it was his doing. He also said that he would do whatever she wanted, as long as she just said so. Amber didn't expect such an act from him. However, this was not enough for her. She did not need only material goods. She wanted to live in peace, in love, to love and to be loved. The girl plucked a sprig of lily of the valley and sank into a dream for a couple of seconds. She imagined that one day they could have a complete family with 2 children. But their dreams were completely different, and she understood this and did not want to put up with it. And Amber decided to play this game. She turned to the Duke with the words that she would stay by his side, and also that she will no longer talk about divorce and will obey him. The Duke was clearly pleased with the girl's answer and smiled good-naturedly at her, but she agreed to herself that she would continue to play the role of a loving wife. Fortunately, it was easy for her to do this, since some feelings for him still glimmered in her. She uses these feelings to lull his vigilance and distract him from her real intentions, namely, to leave once and for all. The servants also noticed the changes, and they often whispered that the Duchess was glowing, and the Duke began to spend more time with her alone. In the evening before dinner, Jim was busy with business as usual, and his assistant was with him. He was studying the letter carefully when Amber entered the dining room. Entering the dining room, Amber greeted him and praised him for his efforts throughout the day. The Duke reciprocated her feelings and invited her to the table, as dinner would soon be served. Not only the servants, but also Luke were shocked by their behavior and communication. When dinner was served, they ate and had a very warm conversation at the same time. Jim informed her that an invitation had arrived from Alexandria to a ball in honor of her imminent birth. Amber was surprised by this invitation, but she understood that it came to her since she was also part of this family. The Duke handed the letter to Luke and asked him to pass it on to Amber. The assistant silently handed the letter to the girl and returned to the Duke. After reading the letter, she realized that absolutely everyone would be invited, and it turned out that her mother would be there too. But Amber didn't want to meet her, because she knew there would be another scandal. As if reading her mind, the Duke said that if she did not want to, she could refuse the invitation. Besides, he himself would not be able to accompany her, but she still replied that she would go. The Duke accepted her decision without any objections and wished her a good time. The Emperor's palace was as beautiful as ever when Amber arrived at the ball. At the palace, she was met by Alexandria herself, who was very happy about her arrival. The Emperor's daughter was very pretty in this position and told the Duchess the news that had happened since their last meeting. Amber listened to her attentively and silently admired this girl. Not far from them stood 2 girls who were whispering, periodically glancing at the Duchess. Amber didn't like this situation at all and decided to take a walk around the palace. As she walked down the corridor, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw her stepmother and was annoyed by this meeting. Anna greeted her daughter with her sarcastic voice, replying that her daughter had not even come up to her and was already running away. Coming closer, the mother suggested that they talk somewhere else so that they would be alone. But Amber didn't move and only asked what her mother wanted from her. Angered by her daughter's lack of understanding, Anna turned to her, saying that she really wasn't aware of the rumors circulating about her and the Duke. The girl did not understand what rumors her mother was talking about. Anna was very angry with Amber's behavior, and she started shouting, not holding back her emotions. Her mother told her about the rumors circulating about her among the nobility and asked if the Duke was definitely not going to divorce her. Amber finally realized what her mother was talking about. Duchess Missy had spread these rumors. Anna was disappointed with her daughter, because of her behavior and disobedience, they had to constantly lose face. However, Amber was tired of being insulted and suggested that her mother leave. The mother was stunned by such insolence on the part of her daughter, but Amber didn't pay attention and said that it was already late and she wanted to go to the bedroom to rest. Realizing that she was losing control of the situation, Anna reminded everyone that by abandoning her family, the girl would become a commoner from the street, unwanted by anyone. Ignoring her mother's cries, the Duchess turned and headed for the door. Approaching the door, she reached for the handle. Hearing her mother screaming about seducing the Duke, Amber was quite fed up with these orders, and opening the door, she asked the butler to escort Marquise Anna. The Marquise was simply seething with anger at this behavior. Amber no longer listened to her mother, and having said her last word that she didn't care about their opinions, she decided to leave. As the butler directed the Marquise to the exit and closed the door, Anna continued to shout threats at her daughter. But Amber didn't care. She had already decided everything for herself, and she would leave the Duke, no matter what it cost her for the sake of her happiness. The next day, the Duchess went down to tea with the Empress. Emily asked her about the Duke and their relationship, and wished that the young Duchess would come to see them more often. She promised that she would try her best, feeling a little sad that she had to lie. After staying for a little while longer for tea, she chatted with other girls, dreaming to herself how she would escape from the Duke and be free. Tired of society, Amber went out into the garden for a walk. Suddenly, a strong wind arose, which tousled her curls a little. It became so cold in the garden that it seemed as if winter was about to arrive. Suddenly, the little priest she had met in Thomas's temple appeared in front of her. The Duchess did not expect to see him here, but was very glad to meet him. They greeted each other, and Amber asked if Thomas had arrived with him. After removing the leaf from the girl's hair, the boy replied that Thomas had arrived, but that he was busy at the moment and would not be able to meet her. But he asked him to keep an eye on Amber and help if needed. The little priest also introduced himself, calling himself Alan. Alan asked the Duchess's name, if that was acceptable. Putting aside the opinions of others, Amber nevertheless told her name to the little priest. Alan really liked the Duchess's name. However, Amber was worried about what he was doing alone in such a large garden. As it turned out, the priest Thomas allowed him to take a walk, which surprised the girl. Alan just shrugged and smiled. Amber suggested that they go for a walk with her, as it was easy to get lost in a garden like that. The priest agreed to the proposal. The Duchess took his hand, and they went for a walk in the garden together. However, Alan assured Amber that he wouldn't have gotten lost on his own either. He admitted that he was actually older than she thought. Amber asked how old he really was, but Alan kept it a secret for now, citing the fact that men with secrets are more attractive. And they walked through the garden, chatting pleasantly, including about Thomas, who was very busy. Amber was upset that she wouldn't be able to meet the priest. However, she had previously heard that he would be busy the whole month and that she would be leaving in 3 days. But Alan tried to calm her down, saying that Thomas had given him something to do. He said that he would help her in Thomas's absence. Even when Amber leaves for her palace, Alan will be there. But looking at the little priest, the Duchess did not understand how he could help her. Suddenly, Alan stopped and said that he would like to keep the secret longer. But Amber's reaction was too charming. He moved a little further away from her, and a bright, warm light appeared around him. When the light disappeared, instead of the little priest, a young man of about 20 appeared before her. Seeing the girl's reaction, Alan smiled and said that this was his real appearance. Amber's mouth dropped open in amazement, and the priest explained that he could use magic to change his appearance. He waited patiently for her to come to her senses. The Duchess was surprised, and Alan apologized for having to deceive her a little. Amber couldn't take her eyes off the priest's new appearance. Something about it really attracted her. He explained that he was not yet big enough like Thomas, but he had enough strength to help her. Alan walked closer to Amber, and she noticed that he was holding something in his hands. He had a small ball in his hands. He called it a divine artifact that must be kept next to the pendant. He handed the ball to her, and it glowed with the same light for a while. There was a message inside this ball, and she had to listen to this message alone, because there were a lot of ears around. She assured him that she would do everything as he said. Alan also added that sacred magic is not given to everyone, and created a flower out of thin air. He gave this flower to the Duchess and said that he who has magic is worthy of the love of the gods. And since she has this magic, she is also worthy of the love of the gods. Amber was still fascinated by Alan and just looked at him in admiration. Alan gave her a warm smile in response, and as if knowing something, said that everything would be fine. At the same time, in the palace, Jim was talking with the commander of the soldiers assigned to Amber. He listened to a report about what the Duchess was doing in the Emperor's palace. The next morning, Amber had already arrived back at the palace to see the Duke. When they arrived, her coachman announced that they had already arrived. He walked around the carriage, opened the door, but discovered that the Duchess had fallen asleep. Amber was so tired that she fell asleep on the way. The coachman called Amber again, but she did not want to wake up. Once again, when the coachman wanted to call her, someone touched him on the shoulder. He turned around and saw the Duke standing behind him, gesturing for the coachman to be quiet. The coachman bowed to Jim and walked away from the carriage, letting him through to Amber. The Duke carefully picked up the girl in his arms and carried her to the palace so as not to wake her. He looked at her tenderly and said that he was glad that she had returned home. Amber still didn't wake up while he carried her to the palace. The day before, the commander of the soldiers reported that the Duchess had behaved calmly and had not shown any particular activity. He also said that on one of her walks, there was a priest with her. Jim was surprised that there was a priest next to her, and he wanted to know what they were talking about, but the soldiers were unable to hear their conversation. After listening to the chief, the Duke ordered that Amber be kept under surveillance and that everything be reported to him. After the conversation, the Duke thought for a long time about Amber's behavior. These thoughts even gave him a headache. He could not fully convince himself that she was sincere with him, and he decided to watch her from the shadows. While in her bedroom with Lindsay, Amber asked who had carried her out of the carriage. The maid replied that the Duke himself had done it, adding that they looked very happy together. And while Lindsay admired them, the Duchess was pleased with how they looked from the outside. Amber needed to be alone and asked for some tea. When she was left alone, she took out the box with the pendant and the ball onto the table. She opened the box and looked at the pendant for a moment. When she connected them together, an incredible light began to emanate from them, filling the entire room. A moment later, the ball split open, and a small scroll appeared in its place. Amber took the scroll and began to read the message Alan had left for her. The message said that after completing his business, he would wait for her at a certain place, and if she could not come immediately, then he would wait for her as long as it took. However, she understood that the soldiers assigned to her would not let her escape. Even if she just went out for a walk, they would be there. She burned the note so that no one would know about her intentions. Having put the pendant on her neck under her dress, she realized that her only way out was to use magic. But she will still try to make Jim soften and remove his guard from her. She liked this determination that had been visiting her lately. They spent a lot of time together with the Duke, walked in the garden, and talked a lot. They even had lunch together, and with each passing day, his attitude towards her became better and better. However, despite this, he did not remove the soldier from her. Amber stood by the window and watched the falling snow. It fascinated her, and at the same time calmed her. She wanted to leave the palace before spring, since the harsher the winter, the more work the Duke has, and the less time they spend together. Today, she even had dinner alone, since he had a lot to do. Suddenly, Amber heard a sound coming from the Duke's bedroom. She followed the sound, but was a little afraid of what she might see. Opening the door, the girl looked inside and called him, but no one answered. Then she walked into the room and saw him lying on the bed. The Duchess decided to come closer and check his condition. She found a broken glass by the bed. Apparently she wanted to drink, but it fell out and broke. Amber crouched down and carefully began to pick up the pieces so that no one would get hurt. Having collected each fragment in a handkerchief, she wrapped it up. The Duchess came closer to the bed to check if he had a fever, but everything was fine, and she covered him with a blanket. Jim looked so tired, but at the same time so attractive, that she couldn't take her eyes off him. He still didn't wake up. Apparently he slept too deeply. For some reason, Amber wanted to touch him, and she gently touched his face. She leaned over and called his name, but he did not respond. He slept quietly and meekly, like a child. And then Amber sighed, not understanding what she was doing, and decided that she needed to call a healer. But as soon as she turned away, he took her hand. The girl turned her head towards him and saw this look that caused warmth inside her. He pulled her closer to him so that there was not much distance between them. They looked into each other's eyes and did not say a word, enjoying this moment. As if afraid to scare him away, Jim gently pulled her onto himself so that she had to climb onto the bed and sit on top of him. His kiss was tender, hot, and full of passion. His hands roamed her back, telling her how much he wanted her. This passion took hold of both of them, and they kissed each other greedily as if they had wanted this for a long time. Having torn the dress from the Duchess, he threw it on the floor as the most unnecessary thing. They fell onto the bed, merging in a hot kiss, forgetting about everything that had happened between them. To Amber's surprise, the Duke was gentle with her, exploring every inch of her body, caressing it tenderly. He was so overcome with pure passion and fire that he pulled her arms back and held them up, while with his other hand he squeezed her thigh. Through moans of passion, she asked him if he remembered their first meeting. He pulled away from her and looked at her questioningly. After a pause of silence, Jim asked if it was really that important now. Amber was a little upset and replied that of course it didn't matter. At that moment, her heart ached again from his coldness. The Duke looked at her with his tender gaze and continued to caress her. Taking her by the hips, he gently but with hot lust took possession of Amber. Jim wished that she would never leave him, and Amber assured him that she would never leave him. They immersed themselves in their love completely and entirely. However, this was her plan. To distract his attention, to cloud his mind, she had to act decisively. But she had also wanted this for a very long time, for them to merge into one, desiring each other like no one else. The Duke changed his tenderness to a wild passion that made Amber moan with pleasure, which further inflamed Jim. He looked at her and understood that she was the only one he wanted to desire in his life. Each of them felt better than ever, and then she realized that she still loved him. She remembered their first meeting, how important it was to her, but she was sad that the Duke did not understand this. Their wedding, which gave her hope for a better life. Their meetings, although short, she always looked forward to them with trepidation. And although his coldness hurts the most, she will never be able to forget these feelings, since they are both shackles and a treasure that she has guarded since childhood. But now she still wanted to get rid of these shackles. After all, it's unlikely that he will love her the way she wants. They fell asleep hugging each other. When he woke up, the Duke was glad to see her next to him and gently kissed her on the head so as not to wake her. He looked at her as she slept, like an angel who had descended to him from heaven. It was foolish to think that she would run away from him, because she clearly felt something for him. He played her voice over in his head, the warmth she radiated, and realized that he had experienced feelings that were unfamiliar to him. And these feelings are real, and she herself is real. She is nearby. Everything he needed. From that moment on, he called away the soldiers who were looking after me, which was unexpected. Amber continued to treat the Duke with awe and love. But the harsher the winter became, the less time they spent together. One such day, Luke came to him in a hurry and reported that monsters were rampaging on the border again. With some excitement, Jim asked how many there were. The assistant reported that their number was unknown, but it was known that they had been joined by the remaining people from the overthrown kingdom, and the soldiers could not advance confidently. Jim ordered to move out immediately, and the servants standing nearby wished him victory, but he himself slowed down a little, which caused Luke to ask a question. The Duke ordered Luke to prepare the horses and wait for him. He himself turned around and almost ran to look for Amber to say goodbye. He hurried up the stairs to her bedroom. Halfway there, she met him and asked what had happened. He told her that the borders were unsettled and he needed to leave for a while. Amber was surprised, because he had not previously reported where he was going. He looked at her as if he was afraid that he was seeing her for the last time. She looked at him silently, not knowing what to say. She came closer and called her by name. Without letting him finish, she touched his chest with her hand and said that she would wait for him. These words made him happy, and he tried to remember this moment, her voice, her eyes. However, a question arose in his mind as to whether she was truly sincere with him. But remembering their nights and her attitude towards him lately, he removed these doubts. She stood in front of him and looked at him with eyes full of love, and he promised her to return as soon as possible. And if she had known what would happen next, she would never have let him go.